towards historical singularity. Marxist theory of knowledge, intelligent machines, and the organic nature of the Revolutionary Party. Published in Quinterna n+1 number 40 in 2016, translated by Balance Y. Avant. The increase of the productivity of labor and the maximum negation of necessary labor is, as we have seen, the necessary tendency of capital. The realization of this tendency is the transformation of the means of labor into machines. The evolution of the means of labor into machinery is not accidental for capital, but is the historical transformation and readaptation of the means of labor inherited from tradition into a form suitable for capital. The accumulation of science and skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus with respect to labor, absorbed into capital, and thus appears as a property of capital, and more precisely of fixed capital, in so far as it enters into the process of production as a real means of production. Karl Marx, Grundriss. The machine and the system of machines. Machines are an integral part of the history of capitalism as they are indispensable to increasing production and draining surplus value. Having become intelligent and autonomous, they not only change the structure of production but also the social order, as they make a large part of the labor force irreversibly redundant. For Marx, every manifestation of knowledge presupposes the totality of knowledge given in a society. Thus Greek art presupposed Greek mythology, which in turn drew on the material world of production and reproduction. Thus Greek science too had to presuppose the social relations of Greece. If art is a form of language and the latter is a means of production, science certainly cannot be any less. Therefore art and science, which in Greek times were not as separate as they are today, could not be independent of mythology or society. Marx gives the example of the Iliad. Would Homer be possible in the age of printed paper? And Achilles in the age of firearms? Today's mythology is science. It provides a complete picture of the society in which we live. We cannot do without it. Some believe in it as one believes in a religion. Others see it as a danger, a disease of humanity. Even if we are skeptical, or criticize some of its results, or see how little it serves to alleviate the disasters of capitalism, science forces us to live at its pace. We carry a smartphone in our pockets, we use cars and computers, we are totally surrounded and dependent on it. Since we chipped the first stone with a deliberate gesture to achieve an intended result, the path is marked, we and technology are forced to co-evolve. Somehow an irreversible welding between the living and the mineral has occurred. It is pointless for us to complain or boast about this outcome. It is more fruitful to investigate its consequences on the society we live in, i.e. the capitalist society, in order to understand what our future might be and how we get there. In any case, if Achilles is annihilated by the rifle, Napoleon is annihilated by the atomic bomb. The scale changes, but when an old form comes into contact with a new one, the annihilation of the old one is inevitable. Science has long since begun to annihilate the present mode of production, and Marx analyzed the automatic machine system as an expression of the social brain, as something that helps to abolish the present state of affairs. It is obvious that if an Achilles in a scenario in which rifles appear, or a Napoleon with the atomic bomb, is not possible, then capitalism in which systematic, growing negations of capitalism appear is not possible. The myth, in this society, is quantitative production, the qualitative aspect being solely linked to use value, without which every commodity would be unsaleable. But in order to reach the heights of productivity required by competition, it is necessary to devise ever more sophisticated means of production, real systems of machines and men that at some point become automated and in so doing become autonomous as if they lived a life of their own. Capitalism is a totalitarian mode of production, admitting no half measures. In a finite market, it pours a virtually infinite quantity of goods. There are no theoretical limits to the amount of goods that can be produced. The only constraint is in the cost of the factors of production, plant, raw materials, energy, labor power. The factors of production contribute to accelerating the quantitative race, both because it is necessary to spread the costs over a greater number of commodities, and because the increase in production always entails a decrease in the average unit value, and it is necessary to make up with the physical quantity the loss in percentage. Remember the formula, profit rate equals surplus value capital brought forward. We know for a fact that the ancients used machines, even sophisticated ones. Some were ends in themselves, built out of curiosity or amusement, most were built as being useful. But there were no devices that, connected in some way, gave rise to machine systems. These appeared with capitalism and developed early within the feudal form. The automatic machine systems that existed in Marx's time within industry already represented a fairly evolved network in which mechanical elements transmitted energy and information useful for the production of goods. And there were forms of network such as road, rail, and telegraphic networks. In short, the evolution of technology from a certain point onwards made machines into a system and, from an early stage, the latter began to become automatic and programmable, hence autonomous. There is a big difference between the computer and Pascal's or Leibniz calculators, but the difference becomes much thinner when comparing the computer to programmable machines such as the Babbage-Lovelace calculator or the Jackwood punch-card loom, both products of the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, let us take Marx's observations on machine systems as valid and try to identify what the nature of the phase transition we are currently experiencing might be, from automation as the engine of the gigantic historical increase in productivity, to robotization as a qualitative change within a social system that structurally cannot bear it. The reasoning is well known and isn't borderline. That is to say, one can draw a theoretically exact scenario by taking to extremes what is already at work in today's society. For example, we can easily understand what could happen to capitalism if robotization were total, if workers were completely replaced by machines. Obviously, capitalism would blow up long before it reached that point. In order to avoid the appearance of ideological elements that may pollute the calm description and understanding of the model we are about to describe, let us take a practical example. Everyone knows that in a modern country like Italy, the state absorbs, on average, more than half of income through taxation. It is then said that, considering the arc of a year, until June-July, one has worked for the state and only thereafter for oneself. The same reasoning is made in the ecological field, calculating an annual renewal cycle of raw materials, energy, etc. We say that mankind, in 2016, consumed all the renewable resources of the planet already in September. With the same criteria, we can draw a model that shows us the degree of advancement of automation, robotization in the production system, i.e. the degree of labor liberation. In Marx's time, the average worker worked for himself during one half of the working day, during the other half he worked for the capitalist. Luciano Gallino calculated that today in a modern automobile factory, the worker works about 40 minutes for himself and the rest he gives to the master, who, in turn, must distribute this rest in the form of interest, income, dead expenses such as administration, storage, etc. Capitalism has not yet collapsed because, as economists have empirically observed, so far there has been a substitution effect. The labor force freed from production peculiar to an epoch has gone to cover new markets for the labor force itself. But in the meantime the use of ever more sophisticated machines and ever more integrated systems has not stopped, so that we have gone from a typical real unemployment rate of 5% to at least 3 times that, and in the case of young people even 10 times that. It is even trite to observe that mankind has not benefited at all from the liberation from work, which on the contrary has become a social plague accompanied by an increase in relative and even absolute overpopulation. It's not a union issue. As long as there is capitalism, the elimination of working time cannot be transformed into living time. While billions of people have the only prospect of becoming part of the absolute overpopulation, i.e. of being not unemployed, but without the possibility of employment, machines are beginning to become not only prostheses amplifying our capacities, but substitute instruments. This aspect of the new machinism cannot be addressed with the old trade unionist or reformist schemes. The above is a seemingly straightforward matter, and seems simple to understand and solve. Some propose to decrease working hours a little, launch plans for low-cost employment, undertake public works, diversify the types of employment through vocational training, etc. In reality, such a release of labor hides deep causes that cannot be exorcised with late Keynesian expedients. The original Keynes was for the controlled increase of wages, as this would satisfy the marginal propensity to consume, i.e. the expendability of a surplus provided to low-income social strata, whereas an increase in the capitalist's income would only feed the financial, i.e. speculative, sector. The modern impact of technology on production and people's lives can no longer be addressed by immediate demands from the trade unions on the capitalists. Marx, in the same page we quoted at the beginning, says that a man who would become a child again would be a senile man, whereas the childlike humanity of the Greeks offers us an art that gives us excitement despite later social development. Productivity is the art of today's humanity, and the latter cannot become a child again except by regressing to past levels and patterns of production. Such regression, however, is completely incompatible with capitalism's constant need to increase productivity. It would be its death. The trouble is, for the capitalists, that if the system is left to itself, it will also be death. It was not by chance that capital tried the path of state control, i.e. fascism. The chaotic movement of private capital had to be disciplined, and this was done all over the world. But once the efficacy of the model was established, there was a shift from state control over capital to capital control over the state. Marx has no doubt, this shift is one of the symptoms of the death of capitalism. In its time potential death, today actual death. Our current has systematized the analysis of this phenomenon, the corpse still walks, by identifying the extreme contradiction of a society founded on capital but made up of capitalists without capital, the set of those employed in the satisfaction of its needs, and capital without capitalists, the set of private capital collected in society and grouped in large masses managed by officials, pension funds, investment funds, bank funds. Private capitalist enterprise is now entirely camouflaged. It has no real estate ownership, no factories, no fixed headquarters, no definite owners, no flying yards, and relatively insignificant machinery compared to the colossal movements of business. It does not even have financial capital, which the state and for it the bank puts at its disposal on the sole basis of the order. In it, the sweetest modern idyll between private initiative and state monopoly takes place. For 9/10 it is in this form that in peace and war today capital, more than ever anonymous as Marx describes it, haunts humanity. There are companies, employing a total of millions of wage earners, that are already cybernetic organisms whose functioning is entrusted to a coupling of biological and electronic brains. Walmart, a retail chain with 2.2 million employees, already devotes its operations to a complex network of sensor actuators that from the mine, the field, the shop or the end consumer send signals to a processing center which, in turn, directs activities. In recent years, countless papers have been published that approach the subject from different perspectives. Of course, the focus is on technology insofar as it, as the offspring of science, would produce havoc, or, according to opposing schools, would be able to save mankind from misery and the leading of a meaningless life. It is clear from all these works that capitalism is on its last legs. It may not disappear immediately swept away by a revolution, but it is but a zombie, unable to organize its survival decently. In this sense the unemployment we are talking about is no longer a matter for trade union negotiations. Or rather, there will still be an attempt to solve the problem through organisms and methods of the past, but no one in the world will be able to change the senescence of capitalism. The process is irreversible, even if it is cloaked in brilliantly performing machines, capable of replacing men on an unprecedented scale. A few months ago, the Confindustria newspaper published a series of pamphlets, later offered on CD, on new technologies, from robotics to the use of mountains of data, from nanotechnology to networks, etc. The aim was to instill a sense of new technology in people. The intention was to instill optimism, given the perceived favorable and revitalizing impact of technology on this era in which machines now fill the horizon from everyday life. But there was little optimism to be had from the point of view of the production of surplus value, the primary purpose of the current mode of production. If anything, the collection of those pamphlets showed that it will be increasingly difficult to derive surplus value from a situation of decreasing profit rates. We mentioned at the beginning how surplus value derives from the difference between the whole working day and that part of it which the worker needs, in the form of wages, to reproduce himself. The share of surplus value may be high, but there must be a population that can buy the immense amount of production possible. And when a worker works half an hour for himself and more than 7 hours for others, he will be able to acquire little more than what he already has. The march of intelligent machines. The replacement of humans by intelligent machines and the new type of interaction between man and machine are producing effects in the ideological and scientific fields. Humanity is beginning to ask new questions about its future. This means that the future acts more than ever on the present. Once upon a time, workers destroyed the machines that threw them out of the factory. Today, they should destroy all factories and the logistical chain that unites them, because for a long time now the real machine is no longer a workshop piece, but the workshop itself, integrated into a vast and complex system. This transformation was already underway in the 19th century, but tradition still wanted the machine as a substitute for the worker, not as part of a system capable of changing the world. The evolution of systems is a process in which new configurations emerge around a mutant element, be it man or machine. It is therefore the transition from lower to higher order levels, where lower and a higher do not mean the rungs of a hierarchical ladder but the achievement of an optimal degree of adaptation to the context. As in all revolutions, whether scientific or social, at every level, or era, economic form, etc., men use the tools typical of their environment to develop those suited to the environment to come. This is equivalent to saying that the future environment is already present in the present one, that certain tools represent anticipated forms to come, as we wrote on the home page of our internet site quoting Marx's Grundrisse. In phase transitions, what was optimal becomes obsolete, or, if suitable, becomes a disruptive element that helps the new level come into being. Today's intelligent machines are of this second type. Today's society is particularly sensitive to so-called development. For capitalism to be at its best, for capitalists, of course, it is necessary for the significant elements of its structure to grow. It does not matter how, whether with the reintroduction of slavery in a modern key or with sophisticated robots, as long as they grow. Returning for a moment to the examples given earlier, that of taxes to pay for which one works an average of 6 months a year, that of the waste of renewable resources consumed every year already by September, and that of the division of the working day into half an hour for the worker and 7.5 hours for the capitalist, we see that the problem of growth begins to become insoluble. The tax levy can be increased and made more progressive, but there is a limit beyond which a drug effect is triggered, whereby the economic system tends towards habituation by demanding higher and higher doses until the overdose that kills it. The consumption of resources has a physical limit that is the finiteness of the planet. The drainage of surplus value has a double limit. 1. The duration of the working day cannot exceed the hours of actual work, to which must be added the hours for the regeneration of the labor force, so the significant point separating necessary work from surplus labor can move within a dozen hours at most. 2. This system clashes against the mathematical certainty that the same amount of surplus value cannot be extracted from a few workers as from many. Not only are machines replacing men, and they will still do so as long as capitalism exists, but they are always imposing new models of production, more rational, automatic, fast. Faced with this kind of certainty, mankind begins to think that there may be problems with the survival of capitalism as it is today, and it does so for the time being by remaining within the capitalist system, imagining that with a few technical, organizational, political and economic changes, the system can be brought to controlled growth, or even to do without growth. This is simply an illusion based on nothing, as the march of science and technology as supports for production shows. Capitalism is a system based on the law of positive feedback. Value input into the production cycle must be transformed into more value output. It cannot, therefore, simply find an equilibrium. It would be capitalistically nonsensical for the immense productive machine that now covers much of the planet to return the system to an output equal to the input. Exchanging one book for a different book makes sense, but exchanging $100 for $100 is just wasted time since there is no quantitative difference. How this difference between input and output is achieved today depends on the structure of society as a whole, on the force exerted by millions of free capitals on their holders, therefore necessarily beyond any control, as shown by the systemic crisis the capitalist world has been in since when? Since 1970, since 1975, since 1987, or since 2008. When did the era of capital dead that walks begin? Marx observed that its autonomization from the capitalist who owns it means a declaration of potential death. Today there is little to add. Its survival is a purely political question concerning power, not the now exhausted propulsive thrusts. Law of exponential accelerating returns. Capitalism will not die because it is killed by the conscious proletariat, but, like all modes of production, because it has long since reached the final phase of its life cycle and, in this condition, it will unleash the force that must bury it, the proletariat directed by its party. The law of accelerated returns is nothing but the technical's transposition of the law of accumulation. This is the law that forces capitalism to make ever more intelligent machines. Their tendency towards autonomization is an evolutionary consequence. The law of positive feedback produces, in all phenomena subject to it, exponential growth. In nature, this type of growth does not exist except for limited times. There may be exponential growth for a given period, but then, inexorably, there is either a collapse or an asymptotic trend. As far as the future of the capitalist mode of production is concerned, it would be enough for economists, and also those who refer to Marxism, to read the research conducted by many bourgeoisies on the cumulative nature of knowledge, especially in the technical scientific sphere, to conclude that it is practically dead. Ah! Exclaim the all-out Marxists, but then you are of those who are waiting for the spontaneous collapse of capitalism, so no revolution, no insurrection, no seizure of power, no dictatorship of the proletariat, etc., etc. The accusation is almost correct, but the fundamental point studied by Marx is the transitory nature of modes of production and the societies that correspond to them. In their succession, there is a dynamic that is perfectly traceable to physical social laws, a dynamic that allows the end of capitalism to be predicted with certainty. This certainty means that, from a scientific point of view, there is no point in asking what the killer agent might be. We know that the proletariat will be the gravedigger of this dying society, but it is not necessarily the proletariat that is the cause of death. In science you don't prepare theories on hypotheses, you look for laws and use them to understand reality. Capitalism's worst enemy is capitalism itself. It is its contradictory mechanisms, its parabola of diminishing returns. Always, in history, an old mode of production dies when a new form with a higher social return emerges. And the class that takes the place of the dominant one assumes a program appropriate to the transition, participates in it, gives itself a consequent political organ. The priests of current science, the enthusiasts of the progress that is possible even if it is not realized, but communism is possible immediately, with the means we have today, do not think of a completely new society for the time being, but by describing what is theoretically realizable they give it substance. Raymond Kurzweil is one of these. Inventor, scientist, epistemologist, futurologist, he foresees an epochal turning point as soon as science will allow the creation of machines using an artificial intelligence similar to ours. The turning point will occur when this transitional situation completely disrupts the current paradigm of knowledge. The problem to be solved, for now, is the weakness of our intelligence in understanding its own functioning. With an artificial aid, we will overcome this stumbling block and finally manage to understand ourselves. Only then we will find ourselves with a diffuse intelligence that is superior to both biological and artificial intelligence. We will have something completely new capable of learning, self-replicating and so on. Without limits, because such an intelligence will be able to permeate all matter in the universe and make it capable of consciousness. This will be possible through the development of current machine intelligence because the feedback of new inventions, and therefore of new possibilities for computation, is exponential, involving an acceleration of the running machine for brain simulation. This does not, in the author's view, rest on any evolution or revolution of the system that should express this power. He simply wishes the current system to remain democratic, in the Western form, so as to allow research free of ideological influences. In this environment, as in a breeding ground, our brains will be able to overcome their relative weakness and develop those capacities that, acquired over millions of years and refined through experience, such as the capacity for abstraction and above all modeling of reality, make us biological beings different from other beings. Abstraction and modeling are the prerequisites for the development of knowledge and thus of a broader and more powerful consciousness than we have today. But it is thanks to the help of machines that we will be able to achieve this synthesis between the biological and the artificial. This paradigm shift, a la Thomas Kuhn, will eliminate the distinction between machine and human, and physical reality, described as a collection of information, will not be distinguished from modeled reality, since the latter is also nothing more than organized information. Such summits of faith in science border on pure philosophical speculation, and the contrast between the scientific apparatus and the banalities that flow from an unabashed adherence to the capitalist form border on the ridiculous. Kurzweil predicts, for example, that in half a century there will be drugs that will allow us to eat to our heart's content without getting fat. We are not going to criticize these implications of faith in capitalism, a phenomenon that involves not only the avowed bourgeoisie but also those who have infiltrated the ranks of the proletariat. Instead, it is interesting to note how, from within the bourgeoisie, the tendencies produced by the dying form are being released. For us, it is quite clear that, if we disregard ideological veins and some naivety, we are faced with the description of a society based on an extended intelligence, a social brain, capable not only of knowing itself, but of using this knowledge to plan the search for unexplored fields, to the point of identifying itself with the environment universe to make it capable of a reversing praxis, i.e. of planning its own future according to the law of exponential accelerated returns. If we take away that bit of utopia and science fiction, the description of universal intelligence may recall not only a paradigm shift but also a change in social form. The singularity is a catastrophic event, a bifurcation, a cusp in the history of modes of production. It is in every sense a revolution. Only an intelligence that already exists can suggest such a total destruction of the old paradigm, to the point of even hypothesizing the intelligent colonization of the entire universe. And an intelligence that already exists for us today is the historical party, the anticipator of the future society, the prompter, to a mutant minority, of theories on paradigm change. To imagine an integrated human-machine intelligence at the level of neurons and artificial cells, we have to come to terms with quantum reality, an elusive element and too much like a science that also needs a phase transition. Be that as it may, whether realizable or not, Kurzweil's singularity is certainly a product of what it is asserting. A logical paradox, an autopoiesis in action, moreover declared. Growth in computing power. Intelligent machines get smarter and smarter both as computing power increases and as questions evolve that require computing power for answers. The singularity predicted by some scientists will certainly occur, but not when we realize that machines have surpassed us in intelligence, but rather when we build machines capable of answering the question, in what social context can a machine more intelligent than us develop its power in order to catapult humanity beyond the tipping point? The theory of accelerated returns is very convenient, it explains a bit of everything. It is indeed true that the advent of the computer has brought about a fantastic acceleration in performance, which can be explained by the reflection of computing power on the time it takes to influence existing reality. By the 1920s, we will have the data collection and computational tools necessary to create models of the entire brain and simulate it, which will make it possible to combine the operating principles of human intelligence with the forms of intelligent information processing that we have derived from other research on artificial intelligence. We will have the advantages derived from the inherent power of machines for storing, retrieving, and rapidly sharing huge amounts of information. We will then be in a position to implement these powerful hybrid systems on computing platforms that will far exceed the capabilities of the relatively fixed architecture of the human brain. Computational power is not a property of computation but of the structure and architecture of the components used for computation. That is, of technology and its development. If this is so, and we believe it to be so, then computing power is nothing more than the state-of-the-art of microcircuit technology. Rightly so, it is indirectly measured by the number of transistors that can be etched onto a silicon plate. This means that the increase in the number of transistors leads to increasing miniaturization of circuits, so that the technology required approaches the size of the atomic world. Furthermore, the speed of computing now conflicts with the speed of light, as the path of a signal on the medium that carries it, bus, can slow down the performance of a processor. All indications are that we are not too far from the physical limit of existing technology, and that the intermingling of born and produced may be very close indeed will we bring biological cells and mineral atoms into symbiosis. The former are made up of the latter and, as we know, there is no difference between two carbon or hydrogen atoms, one coming from a biological tissue, say, and the other from the mineral world. There is talk of a DNA computers or quantum computers. It may be that scientists and technologists manage to copy the living and/or improve the quantum computer. There are some prototypes of these in laboratories. In fact, the born and the produced at this level already collaborate. We thus have two interesting identities, at the level of macroscopic physics, that between matter and energy, at the level of atomic physics, that between atoms, whether they belong to a biological body or to the inanimate world. This means that the phenomenon of a life is in principle a whole with the phenomenon of a non-life, even though they are still considered completely separate. Kurzweil struggles to disentangle himself from the concepts he needs to demonstrate the path that will lead us to a total paradigm shift. He gets lost in economic demonstrations, such as the declining dollar cost of processing capacity expressed in quantitative data. He is completely locked into the society in which he lives. But nevertheless, he is led by his own subject matter to imagine the intelligence that will be able to permeate the entire universe in just 30 years' time. What if we were to reverse this conception? Materialistically speaking, taking into account the determinations that have led living matter to be what it is, including our individual and social brains, it is not accurate to speak of human intelligence conquering the universe. The assertion is too blatantly anthropocentric and goes along with the anthropic principle that the universe is predisposed to produce and accommodate man. If we think that matter and energy are the same thing, and that the atoms of a brain or a galaxy are the same, it is not difficult to arrive at the conclusion that the poet Leopardi already reached: matter thinks. There is no need to wait for the techno-scientific singularity, the overtaking of artificial intelligence over biological intelligence, the spread of the human brain transformed and enhanced to the scale of the universe. Matter thinks because there is no difference between it and us. And so it does not think through us providing it with tools at some point in our development as thinking bipeds, but thinks because it is made that way, because, having reserved the necessary time, it has put together undifferentiated atoms in an equivalent matter-energy context. We are already in Raymond Kurzweil's thinking universe. It is not the growth of computing power that will propel us between galaxies to empathize with them. Quite the contrary. The fact that we are already a small part of millions of galaxies gives us something we call computing power. Once this has emerged, we only enhance it, and now we do so with what our brain has locked up in a machine. We often repeat that at the level of complex phenomena, and thus also of human society, there is a deterministic chaos within which specific elements of emergent order end up manifesting themselves according to autocatalytic processes, i.e. of self-organization. If we speak of our place in a world capable of self-organizing itself up to the great leap of singularity in which the born and the produced merge into a whole, we must necessarily imagine our own evolution as a preparatory phase, a few million years, of which we are in the throes. That is to say, we are at the same point where our current has begun to describe the millenary arc that joins the two shores of communism, the original and the developed, above the abyss represented by non-communist social forms. Everything is ready. Even the scientists, priests of the scientific myth of capitalism, churn out books on this transition. And they write dates, in our case 2045, by which the present world should disappear. We too have written dates. We have not bothered with physics, mathematics, computer science or other disciplines. We just took the figures of year-on-year increases in industrial production of major countries over a century and copied them into a spreadsheet, the kind they give away when you buy a personal computer. Then we asked the machine to plot a graph. The result was a funnel-shaped diagram. The curves converged towards the date 1975 where they collapsed. They then flattened around zero, synchronizing. They proceeded towards 2008 with ups and downs, always synchronized and always around zero, collapsing again. Since then they have been flat, not deviating from zero. The year-on-year increase in industrial production expresses the trend in the profit rate, the formula for which is a condensation of class relations. To find out what the future holds, we took other figures, namely those of the three parameters described in the previous chapters: state fiscal efficiency, ecological footprint, and productivity growth. Using the least anisometric procedure possible, we combined the curves and derived a date, 2030. It may be that our procedure has less investigative capacity than the very powerful models available to the bourgeoisie, but it arrives at a similar result. The difference lies in the fact that we do not imagine elegant ways out for the parabola that capital is on. If the outlook is as described, it is very likely that humanity will not evolve to the point where it can escape the civil war and embark on the salvation of galactic intelligence. Joking aside, Kurzweil's insights are more important than the conclusions he draws from them. For instance, he states that the ongoing acceleration of brain research by neuroscience will allow access to the fine structure of the brain mass, and this is the tipping point that will open the door to the singularity, for it is only by knowing the biological processes of our faculty of learning that we will be able to emulate and surpass them. Having reached that point, non-biological intelligence will be able to self-analyze itself and begin a super-accelerated cycle of redesigning itself to become more and more powerful. When that intermediate milestone is passed, the spillover effects on technological progress in general will be so massive that the non-enhanced biological brain will no longer be able to comprehend them and will be cut off from further progress. Therein lies the singular point in human history. Consciousness and its traps. The social brain developed by capitalism already has all the characteristics necessary for the phase transition that is leading us to communism. The reflection of the future on the present confuses scientists who cannot detach themselves from it. Therefore, at the same time as they foresee the historical singularity, they keep in their cognitive baggage ancient categories, such as consciousness, or soul, in themselves capable of nullifying any effort to explain the symbiosis between the born and the produced. It would be like saying that to move the engine of a car, one refuels at the pump of thought. There is a categorical statement in our theory of knowledge: mankind will only come to know something about the mind, intelligence, consciousness or learning when it discovers how mankind comes to know, and it will only discover this when it emerges from the capitalist form. From within a system of knowledge, one cannot know everything about the system itself. One must go further into a more powerful and complete system to master the knowledge of the lower level. This is a small summary of much more ponderous passages, which echo the famous Gödel proof that shook mathematical logic in the last century. If from within a given system we cannot embrace all its complexity and therefore need to move up a level, it means that evolution would fail if the social form is not overcome. So in a sense, revolutions are necessary for evolution, at least as far as our species is concerned. But if this is the case, Kurzweil's entire argument rests on very fragile foundations. If a revolution is necessary to access the higher rungs of knowledge, how does one arrive at the historical singularity without a political revolution? It could be argued that reasoning in science, a Kuhn-like paradigmatic revolution, is more than sufficient, but in this way the whole holistic construction that underpins the becoming of the singularity is skipped. Once the model is required to treat data and concepts according to unitary and invariant criteria, it is no longer permissible to return to a reductionism, moreover dualistic, science on the one hand, society on the other. Intelligence and consciousness merge in the fact that these properties of the brain are a combination of information and computational capacity. Such a configuration will enable us in the future to retro-engineer the brain to the point of providing it with capacities superior to the natural ones in order to realize intelligent systems based on the combination of biological and artificial brains. It will then be possible to reconsider the nature of so-called consciousness, including emotions. And since there are no theoretical impediments to capturing such a memory, it will be possible to download data from a human brain and transfer it to a non-biological medium. This will allow the artificial part to greatly exceed the natural part, if it can still be called that. If, as Kurzweil says, man is the first truly free species, capable of shaping not only the world around us but also itself according to design, then we are close to the demise of Darwin's natural selection. We must say goodbye to the evolutionary force that shaped us. What happens to consciousness in such a situation? If we are able to understand what the brain is, biological or otherwise, and to manipulate it, we are also able to overcome the limits of complexity and chaos, to make predictions where today there is indeterminacy or where fortuitous events occur that can only be analyzed statistically. Similarly, it will be possible to overcome, as far as consciousness is concerned, the need to trace individual behavior back to a general abstraction. In fact, extended computability can also tell us something about the nature of subjectivity, hence of the areas hitherto the domain of psychology, and one wonders whether psychology will also disappear, which would not be a bad thing. Here Kurzweil concedes something to philosophy, which only has anything to do with science in the world of societies that operate dualism between branches of knowledge. In fact, a solipsistic mysticism even appears, almost quietly but very clearly. Consciousness is not detectable through objective measures, typical of science, hence philosophy has its own specific role here, since the problem of consciousness is ontological and not epistemological. In a world without subjective, conscious experience, there would only be matter in continuous transformation, without a conscious observer recording it. that world might as well not exist. And he cites as proof the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, according to which reality only manifests itself at the moment of observation, the famous Schrödinger's cat, alive and dead at the same time until its reality is revealed by observation. The question of whether or not an entity is conscious is only apparent to itself. The difference between neurological correlates of consciousness and the ontological reality of consciousness is the difference between objective and subjective reality. This is why we cannot propose an objective detector of consciousness without incorporating scientific assumptions into it. I believe that we human beings will eventually admit that non-biological entities are conscious, because eventually non-biological entities will exhibit all those subtle clues that human beings currently exhibit and that we associate with emotions and other subjective experiences. The separation of self-consciousness from objective consciousness has to do with logical paradoxes, which are known to be unsolvable, such as that of the meticulous librarian. Having to catalogue thousands of books, he begins to catalogue by title, by author, by subject, by size, and so on. The catalogues become many and the librarian compiles the catalogue of catalogues. At this point he notices that most of the catalogues do not include himself, but some do, so he decides to compile the catalogue of all the catalogues that do not include himself. But he cannot decide whether the new catalogue should include himself. We have recalled the paradox, or logical antinomy, because all discussions of artificial intelligence must come to terms with the set of intelligences that have developed on planet Earth. Difficulties arise because we continue to consider dualistically the set of intelligences that is instead a collective intelligence, considering the biological ones on the one hand, the artificial ones on the other. We cannot catalogue the sets that include or do not include themselves. Kurzweil naturally realizes the problem, but this does not prevent him from devising an ontological proofs for the existence of consciousness. It is here that he borders on solipsism. We see how blurred the boundary between science and metaphysics is in his reasoning. The singularity denotes an event that will occur in the material world, the next inevitable step in the evolutionary process that began with biological evolution and extended into human-directed technological evolution. However, it is precisely in the world of matter and energy that we encounter transcendence, a fundamental connotation of what many call spirituality. To transcend means to go beyond, but this need not lead us to adopt a dualist conception in which transcendent levels of reality, such as spirituality, are considered not of this world. We can go beyond the ordinary powers of the material world through the power of configurations. We transcend through the emergent powers of configurations. As the matter we are made of changes rapidly, what is retained is the transcendent power of our configurations. Their capacity to preserve themselves goes beyond systems that explicitly replicate themselves, such as organisms and self-replicating technology. It is the persistence and power of configurations that sustain life and intelligence. Configuration is far more important than the matter that constitutes it. The boundary is blurred, but if we take the materialistic side and replace configuration with program, the transcendence the author speaks of, the going beyond the existing, may be more familiar to us. Implicit in our theory of knowledge is the materialistic undertone of science as a product of human becoming, of our relative differentiation from nature of which we are a part despite the fact that we continue to separate it from us. Now, we cannot know if there will be this great singular fusion that can bring together the intelligences of the universe. Probably nothing will happen when the time expires, unless the revolution, in the sense of the destruction of the present social form and the advent of a new form, is already complete. In any case, Kurzweil sets out his transcendent march towards total intelligence with observations that in some cases seem very familiar to us. Reality and its models. Science would be useless, says Marx, if the essence of things and its phenomenal form coincided. The succession of modes of production seems to follow a gradual path historically, even if wars and revolutions punctuate it. But by constructing an abstract model of society, we can use it to periodize history and identify changes of course or singularities. The starting point of each form is located at the ending point of the previous form. So it is with science and its paradigms. The historical singularity is always the product of the synchronic change of society and science. Intelligence, we read translating from Kurzweil's language to ours, is a data processing problem. Our brain functions according to the determinations that have shaped it in the course of evolution. When it came to devising machines for processing data, it could only transpose the configurations recorded in its structure into those machines. We are still far from a decent simulation of it, and artificial intelligence has not yet passed the Turing test, but progress is being made. According to the current interpretation of artificial intelligence, the Turing machine can solve any problem reducible to an algorithm devised by the human brain. Ergo, if a problem is not solvable by the Turing machine, it is not solvable by the human brain either. The latter is a collection of matter whose minimal components are no different from any other matter existing in the universe, so it is subject to the laws of nature. This means that these laws, common to man and nature, let us gloss over these remnants of dualism, are describable in the same way, that is, since Galileo first codified the method, contributing to the birth of modern science, they can be modeled in mathematical terms, which in turn can provide the algorithms necessary for complex calculations, simulations, and the ordering of data that were previously too numerous or tangled to be understood. There must therefore be configurations of matter, energy, and algorithms capable of simulating the human brain, including the thought that swirls between neurons and synapses. The current objection to this conception is the classic one: undue reductionism. The human brain, consciousness, mind, have characteristics that cannot be reduced to properties typical of machines. Qualitative data elude investigation on a quantitative, measurable basis. This may be so, but without measurement, without quantitative data, without patterns, configurations, and without experimental verification, there is no science, and nowadays not even philosophy. We deal with this subject by using a book that right from its title promises to dissect the structure of an ongoing revolution, and so we do not linger to emphasize the contradictions, the metaphysical slips, the propensity to imagine that capitalist society can survive the singularity, that is, an event that in itself totally negates it. What matters is the content objectively opposed to any static conception of capitalism, despite the profession of faith for this mode of production. It is perhaps unrealistic to think of a society governed by a post-singularity intelligence, but the vast amount of data demonstrating an ongoing transcendence towards it demonstrates at the same time the existence of a dynamic whose outlet is a radical change in the whole of human relations. To read it through the filter of our doctrine, the book is not only a catalogue of technical findings, of cognitive and productive processes, of theoretical, political and social implications, but it is above all a development over hundreds of pages of one of our significant sketches from 1951, that of the succession of modes of production, and in the caption of which it is written. The curve, with which the much deprecated eucatastrophe theory has been simplified, presents at each epoch points that in geometry are called cusps or singular points. At such points, geometric continuity, and thus historical gradualness, disappears. The curve has no tangent or even admits all tangents, as in the weak Lenin refused to let pass. It should just be noted that the general ascending sense is not intended to bind itself to idealistic visions of indefinite human progress, but to the historical fact of the continuous swelling of the social productive force in the succession of great historical revolutionary crises. There is no doubt that the development of the social productive force cannot continue indefinitely, even though it is by no means comparable to quantitative production. It may well increase the social productive force and decrease the quantity of goods produced, as will have to happen in communist society. Therefore, there is no doubt that the field of technological transformation will expand. The development of global intelligence will certainly be part of this perspective. In this respect, Kurzweil's book has aged somewhat, although it is still useful for the work we are doing. The simulation of biological intelligence by means of an artificial one carbon-based, the other silicon-based, runs up against difficulties that are for the moment insurmountable, even playing favorably with growth statistics such as Moore's supposed law, and the like. Quantum physics is likely to have to intervene, but at the moment there are insurmountable intrinsic limits. No observer, whatever medium is used, can avoid disturbing the observed system, distorting the measurement and thus the calculation. Therefore, in a project aimed at realizing an intelligence comparable and superior to human intelligence, the simulation of evolutionary processes, however accelerated, is implicit, given that the current state of intelligent biological material is the result of millions of years of interactions between various types of matter with energy exchange. It is also necessary to simulate the ability of the components that are to be aggregated into complex molecular chains to read each other's characteristics. We do not know whether this will be possible, as Kurzweil claims, but we are certainly not close to achieving it. It is not enough to identify the components of thought, reproduce them and interact with them as if they were the originals. A carbon atom, as we have said, is still a carbon atom whether it comes from a man or from a bar of graphite. Yet one is in a living context, the other in an inert context. Critical currents within physics, however, argue that this type of reductionism does not correspond to reality, since atoms must be considered not in isolation but as resonant or fluctuating ensembles in which everything is connected, so that there would indeed be a substantial difference between the living and the inert, hence between the born and the produced. A symbiotic superorganism. Machine is any instrument constructed from several elements in order to increase human capabilities or utilize natural forces for the purpose of saving labor. Compared to objects collected in nature for the same purpose, the machine is the more or less complex result of a project. As such, it makes it possible to regularize, to organize previously accidental activities. The machine incorporates collective knowledge, and any refinement of it is only possible by transmitting data that can be obtained from the machine itself when it is in operation. In this sense, every machine is part of a system that necessarily includes man. So a machine is the whole. We will not repeat the accusation of reductionist neo-technicism leveled at Kurzweil for the simple reason that it comes from scientists who have one foot in mysticism in that they expect proof that an artificial brain can harbor somewhere something akin to consciousness. It is certain that if they do not give us a description of this consciousness, and they don't, the criticism falls apart altogether. And in the face of work like Kurzweil's, it is not enough to describe what is meant by consciousness, we must also establish what is meant by a machine when we speak of artificial intelligence. If one means a global set of dynamic configurations capable of relating to the world, then it is likely that we are indeed approaching a singularity, even if that set is certainly not the megagalactic brain imagined by a futurologist. But what can an artificial organism, designed on the basis of its biological, organic counterpart and functioning according to the same principles, be? What could be the social need that could move man to create a machine capable of entering into symbiosis with the human brain? Would it be completely arbitrary to think of the need for a revolutionary party that is not just one party among others, but a complex organism, a cyber-organism capable of unleashing what Kurzweil calls the historical singularity? And finally, are we sure that all this is to be postponed to 2045 and is not already present today, in embryo, in today's society as it is? It could be, if Kurzweil's prediction of a social brain is already causing backlash in the bourgeois ranks. A sign that the singularity is perceptible and evokes deep fears with respect to change. Against the supporters of the reproducibility of the brain down to the level of consciousness, the philosopher John Searle suggests a conceptual experiment. Let us imagine that microsurgery can replace all the neurons, synapses, and other organic material that make up a brain with electronic microcircuits functioning perfectly as if they were neurons, cells, etc. The simulation is perfect, everything is reproduced as it should be. According to the philosopher, the consciousness of the owner of that brain would vanish. It is therefore in the nature of the biological brain to have consciousness, it is in the nature of the artificial brain not to have it. This is what the experiment tells us. A bit like that character in Molière who explained the effects of opium by saying that it contained a vetus dormitiva. Of course, opium makes man sleepy not because it contains sleeping principles, but because it contains substances that are taken up by cells in our body, etc., etc. Searle's explanation is as good as Kurzweil's. Even the reproducibility of all functions, including those attributed to so-called consciousness, requires that consciousness be there and have a special status compared to the wheels of a machine. But let us leave the bourgeoisie to their diatribes and place ourselves, as we already are, outside the fray. Let us imagine that the individual brain with its 100 billion neurons is networked with other brains, each with its 100 billion neurons. Virtually we could have the computing power of 1022 neurons, an unimaginable number. Of course, the operation cannot be done, neither with microcircuits nor with brains. We have to make do with an unimaginative revolution that sweeps away the capitalist rubbish and makes possible a polarization of brains, attuning to the megahertz wave of drastic change in the hardware and software of this society. It used to be called dictatorship of the proletariat and was the transitional result of the concretization of the historical party, the real movement from original communism to developed communism, into a formal party. In the said party, the brain neurons will not be fantastical, but they will act in sufficient numbers to lead humanity out of capitalism. This human machine will certainly be assisted by the machine-machine in a symbiosis somewhat different from that imagined by scientists and philosophers today. The born and the produced will collaborate in the definition of tasks by operating the true fusion. We will know later whether it will be artificial or natural intelligence. Knowing from the outset, however, that there is nothing artificial, everything exists in nature. We have said above that free will is a range of possible decisions worked out by a good program on the basis of a sufficient mass of environmental data. It is clear that a symbiosis between the biological and artificial social brains will enable social cybernetics of enormous power. Let the reader not be misled by terms worn out by capitalist usage in science fiction or common parlance. Cybernetics means the art of holding the helm. After all, even communism is not a term free from usury and counterfeiting. What will be the place of decisions? We do not know, but it does not matter because it will not be a matter of form but of substance. The ontological proof of the existence of the ego. For the verification of the theory of exponential accelerated returns, there is no need to know what consciousness is and what functions it has. The intrusion of philosophy only wreaks havoc around the historical singularity model, which is self-regarding on the hypothesis of co-evolution of humans and machines. Having reached this point, it is clear that we are using the singularity model as a metaphor for the development of the Revolutionary Party, from its historical existence to its formal existence and beyond. It is claimed that consciousness exists and that it is linked to the scientific method of research, which should guarantee its status as a measurable entity, that is, one that can be described in terms of a model. Of course, consciousness is an individual fact, at least as it is usually understood. There are as many consciousnesses as there are human beings, each one different from the other, each one a unique phenomenon. It is difficult to do science when dealing with entities that cannot be generalized. The principle of mathematical induction would not be usable, the search for invariance would be inhibited, reproducibility and thus experimental verification would be skipped. But, it is said, without consciousness, man would not exist and, if we go just a little further, we have seen it. Even a scientist can still claim that the world without an observer is as if it did not exist. This unites Kurzweil, Searle and all their followers. The former claims that consciousness exists and is reproducible, the latter says that it exists and is irreproducible, as the proposed experiment would show. It is not just a question of language, of what name we give to a certain phenomenon. The two positions assume that consciousness is that and nothing else, that it has a place to reside so that it can be placed in symbiosis with the machine or erased by replacing neurons with microchips. As Kurzweil rightly observes, the problem thus posed is not epistemological, but ontological. It is not a question of knowing what that mysterious object is, but of inserting it as existing in the various theories. And this has always been the task not of science but of philosophy. It is not for nothing that it is commonplace to say that science is bound to the ages, while philosophy is timeless. This is not true, but we tend to think so because we place material progress on one side and man's biological, psychological or social characteristics on the other. By thinking in this way we make a mess. Turing's machine works according to a strictly deterministic principle, so if we think that consciousness can be traced back to the computational capacities of the brain, in the manner of the machine, we cannot at the same time argue that it escapes the laws of physics as an exclusively qualitative element. Is it correct to claim, for example, that it is possible to improve the simulation of a physiological process of the body to extreme approximations, but that it is impossible to do the same with the brain? If we are not capable of it, but think it is possible, then we side with those who bring up epistemology. If we think it is impossible, it means that we consider consciousness to be an intrinsic quality of the brain or of the whole body, ontologically undescribable, and therefore not treatable according to scientific methods. Perhaps this is why Kurzweil, by entrusting the brain-machine symbiosis to technology but sticking to the metaphysical conception of consciousness, introduces philosophy. Yet no one thinks to do this when almost all physicists claim that the uncertainty principle derives from an intrinsic quality of matter and not from a lack of knowledge of hidden variables. No one challenges philosophy, at least avowedly, because of the contradiction between the determinism of quantum physics and the indeterminism that is revealed when we measure. This kind of talk leads us directly to the much talked about quantum computer, which would be so powerful that it would allow calculations unimaginable today, as Kurzweil himself says. In fact, such power is intuitable. The world of particles has properties that can be used to compute at an infinite speed, if, for example, the entanglement effect, an instantaneous effect that occurs in the properties of two particles placed in relation, regardless of distance, could ever be exploited. The trouble is that the very properties of matter that would allow us to build a quantum computer are at the root of measurement indeterminacy. We would be faced with a computer that is immensely powerful but unable to allow the detection of results. One could think of statistical detection among billions of events, but at this point, we would have a quantum computer that behaves like an analog computer, i.e., it would lose all the precision obtained by approaching the world of particles. In fact, the real quantum computer today is the one we have in our homes and especially in our pockets. It works brilliantly by exploiting the properties of semiconductors and, for now, is irreplaceable.
Is it enough to enter into symbiosis with our brain?
It seems so, judging by the massive use of personal smartphones, which are small, fast, powerful, invasive, and are now handled well even by children. People keep saying that there is an unbridgeable difference between machines and man, a difference which, scratch that, boils down to the fact that man would have the power to decide, to choose, in short, to behave according to the properties of free will, while the machine does not. This may be true in some respects and false in others. In a fairly sophisticated simulation, it can be shown that most of what we believe to be free will is nothing more than a list of possible choices that a good program considers when faced with stimuli from a sufficient mass of environmental data. From this range, further processing can isolate the optimal choice with respect to the desired outcome. From a practical point of view in this field, the computer already works better than man. Usually, when confronted with these remarks, supporters of the ineffable free will reply, "But that's not what I mean by free will." Well, that may be, but we are talking about science and technology here, not theology. That is to say, we are talking about knowledge and practices useful to the development of the capitalist social form and its consolidation, knowledge and practices taken to the extreme limit of this utilization with the exaltation of computerized and robotized machinism, but at the same time factors of social transformation on which the revolution is already leveraging. For instance, by acting profoundly on the one class that has an interest in the abolition of all classes, starting with the demolition of class-divided society. By taking away its livelihood at the same time as forcing it to produce an unseen mass of valued wealth, relegating it to the condition of no reserve, of absolute precariousness. It is the only class that can take on this historical task because it is determined to mature a specific capacity for struggle, starting from material conditions. However, each element of this class is born, lives, and dies within capitalist society, and absorbs its ideology, so it cannot elaborate a conscious conception of its own future on its own. For the same reason, neither can the totality of these elements develop a theory of social change, for the simple reason that their collective determinations make them a class for capital, not a class for themselves. Neither the individual nor the class can therefore take hold of today's theory of epochal change as the outcome of immediate interests. Everything seems fossilized in the preservation of the present, but, as we read in the 1848 manifesto, the capitalist mode of production is forced to continually revolutionize itself. If words have a meaning, this means that capitalism continually produces its own antithesis. This does not take the form of individual intuition or collective maturation in a cultural sense, nor does it take the form of progress that leads to exciting results of the kind envisaged by Kurzweil. The antithesis of capitalism must be a material representation of future society capable of acting on the present. The ability to describe in advance and hasten the communist future dialectically is to be sought neither in the individual nor in the universal, but found in this formula that summarizes its historical potential: the political party is both actor and subject of the dictatorship. Then we can glimpse something clearer and more functional than the future universality of the social brain, this symbiosis of the individual, collective and electronic processing organ.